Well, g'day everyone. In today's video, I thought I'd bring you into the shed and introduce you to one of the members of our reptilian family. It's an animal that I've never actually maintained in captivity before, been lucky enough to encounter a few out in the wild. But it is going to be interesting because this particular individual is not a big fan of being handled, but that's all part of it. We are trying to get him acclimatized or accustomed to being handled. So we'll get straight into it and hope you enjoy. Well, all right. It's already a little bit interesting, and this is going to be a fairly interesting sort of video. There is every chance, whilst I'm going to try and avoid it at all costs, there is every chance I might actually get bitten by this particular snake. As you can see there, he is actually willing to have a crack. So this is the scrub python. This is Australia's biggest species of snake, and as I mentioned, he is a python. So thankfully, he's not a venomous snake. So the bite is, from a, if you're looking at it from a danger perspective, is technically not very dangerous. However, these guys have huge teeth. Because of his willingness to bite, it would actually still inflict a fairly decent little injury. So, which is sort of why I'm holding him on the hook. Whilst it's not about I'm not necessarily scared or such of being bitten. I'm actually trying to prevent it. There's no heroics or anything like that of being bitten. I've been bitten many times by pythons in the past. It's never pleasant. A snake of this size is really, doesn't hurt too much. Will absolutely inflict a bite that would bleed a lot. It's not something you want to see if we can avoid it. But it's also about just trying to, not upset this particular snake as well. So the Australian scrub python, as I mentioned, this is the Australia's largest species of snake. There are these almost mythological records of this snake getting up to around 8 meters, but it's sort of recorded that these snakes will get up to about 5 meters in length. So they are a huge species of python, one of the biggest species in the world, certainly not the biggest, but sort of one of. And this guy is only about a year old. He's been here for a little over a year. And for his age, believe it or not, he's actually really quite small. And that's because we don't sort of pump the food into anything like that. We're not trying to make him grow at a record rate. We're really more interested in making sure he has a sort of a long life with us. He, as I mentioned, he is the longest species of snake, and at his current length has got a long way to go. So these guys live in the northeast corner of the country, from about Townsville all the way up into Cape York and right up into New Guinea, into the eastern parts of Indonesia. They've gone through several name changes scientifically, but we're just going to know them as the scrubby in Australia. We really typically call them scrubby, or they're also known as the amethyst python or the amethystine python. They're a snake that typically lives in forested habitats and sometimes near water. They don't mind spending times near water. They've got a pretty varied diet. They eat a lot of mammals. They would eat things like fruit bats, and they would also eat birds. And their diet probably changes a bit for obvious reasons from when they're young to when they get a bit bigger. This particular guy eats fairly decent sized rats, but in the wild, he'd probably spend most of his time in the trees, where he would probably eat some birds, maybe some young flying foxes, even some gliders, possums, things like that. And as they get bigger, they would progress into things like wallabies and even tree kangaroos. Things like feral pigs are probably not even off the menu. And so one of the things that enables them to be such a good predator is the size of their teeth. They've got these huge teeth. That means that once they get those into a particular prey item, the prey really doesn't have much chance of actually getting away. And like all pythons, they are a constrictor. So once they grab their prey, they sort of hang on and they wrap around the prey item, constrict it until once the prey item has passed away, then they'll swallow it down whole, like all pythons. So it's as I said, being one of the largest pythons we have here in Australia, there's not many things that actually rival it for size in this country, other than things like maybe the olive python and what we call the Owen Pally python, which is a python species restricted to a very small part of the Northern Territory. This is not a species that's maintained in captivity before. Really excited that my friend Matt was able to sort of send me one across last year. Getting to know the keepings of this particular animal. Being a forest dweller or a rainforest species, the hope is one day we can have a really, really huge, almost walk-in enclosure for this guy. But for now, he lives in a fairly standardized type of enclosure, fairly small, but he will quickly outgrow that. So we will be sort of looking at ways we can improve his sort of living quarters in the coming sort of 6 to 12 months. But they are an absolutely spectacular animal, despite the fact he really wants a piece of me. And you see he's lunged out a couple of times. Once he actually grabbed my jumper. And so he will bite. So despite that, the fact, and again, that's not, I guess, untypical, if you like, of pythons in particular. Pythons are very defensive, particularly young animals. If you were to find these in the wild, they'd be probably just the same. But what we hope is that one day, when he's obviously mature, he's well and truly out of that habit, because a bite from one of these as a mature animal actually has the potential to do some very significant damage, and we're really trying to avoid that. But for now, we'll just have to sort of put up with his less than preferable attitude to being handled and hope that it actually grows out of it and settles down quite a bit. But he is a pretty spectacular animal nonetheless. And right now, all he's really doing is keeping an eye on me, because one of the reasons he's doing that is it's not aggression. And I think that's another significant thing. And this is the same can be said for venomous snakes. What you're seeing here is purely a defensive position. Excuse my jumping, they do it quite fast, so it does catch you off guard from time. So this purely sort of defensive position where they get back in the S-coil is just their last-ditch effort of trying to defend themselves against what they perceive as a predator. So even though he's been living here for 12 months, I actually don't handle him that much, not as much as I would like to or should. So whenever he's actually around, he feels threatened by me. So I'm just a big mammal, and most young snakes in particular will do this. And like I said, venomous snakes are no different. So no snakes really possess any level of aggression. Some snakes are certainly more prepared to defend themselves than others. And these young guys are included on that list. They are very, very defensive and will certainly defend themselves if they feel threatened. So, but don't mistake that for any form of aggression. So these guys won't come and hunt you. They don't prey on people or anything like that. And in fact, I've been lucky to encounter a couple of these animals in the wild, large ones, up around the Cairns region, and they are quite surprisingly quite gentle. But they're all different. They're not all tarred with exactly the same brush. So, you know, what is gentle one day might not be the next. And one snake that I encounter might not be as gentle as a snake that someone else encounters on another occasion. So this guy, as I say, he's not really settling down, but the intent is one, on the hook here, trying not to get bitten. Hopefully him getting sort of used to being handled over a period of time. It's clearly going to take some time, but hopefully we'll get there. And one day, when he's, you know, 3-4 meters long perhaps, we'll be able to handle him quite freely without too much risk. I don't think he's a type of animal I would actually ever take out to demonstrations. I didn't get a scrub python to be necessarily a show animal. I don't believe be the most awesome of show animals, as you like. This is purely a personal thing to get this animal into, you know, into a collection and be able to enjoy it as it gets older. So, you know, I look forward to this little guy, as yet unnamed. I haven't got a name yet. Pretty slack like that. So anyone who watches wants to suggest a name, you know, throw it in the comments below, even if you'd like to suggest a particular name. You know, I haven't been able to think. I often like to call snakes after, you know, maybe where they're from or an area where they're from. The very first animal I ever saw of this particular species was on the Palmerston Highway up in far north Queensland. And unfortunately, that particular specimen had it was a really, really, really unfortunate night. I was with a friend of mine many, many years ago, Richard, and we were out looking for snakes driving along the road at night. And we were being tailed by a car that overtook us as the road opened up. And as they overtook us, the lights sort of illuminated the road, and across the road was about 3+ meters of scrub python across the road, which they unfortunately and then consequently ran over. that snake eventually died. So that was my first experience with a scrub python in the wild, which was still something to this day I never saw and never had happen. However, there was a bit of a silver lining on that same trip. The first one I ever got to see live and, unharmed in its natural setting was at a place called Lake Barine up in the Atherton Tablelands. It's a pretty popular tourist spot, and they're well known to inhabit that particular area. And that was about a sort of 9 or 10 foot specimen. I've got an old photo somewhere of me holding that animal from many, many years ago, and it was an experience I never forgot. And all these years later, fast forward, probably nearly 20 years later, I now actually am lucky enough to maintain this guy in captivity. Although his attitude needs a little bit of an adjusting, but we'll work on that. So if you've got any suggestions for a name, feel free to drop it in the comments below, and maybe one day, we'll know this guy is something that the audience out there has actually named him. So I'm not sure how that's sort of showing up on the camera, because his intent certainly is to look at me. He also has he's just shed his skin, and it's probably very hard to see on there, but he's got, if I move my hand, he's going to have a focus on my hand, so it might actually be all right. But just behind his head there, he's got some skin that hasn't properly come off in his last slough. So we call a slough is the process that when they shed their skin as they grow. And he hasn't sort of shed all his skin. And that sort of is an indicator to me that his cage is not humid enough. We are trying to make sure we maintain a level of humidity in his cage, but because the cage he's in is not his permanent home, it's actually proving a little bit difficult to do so, despite trying to spray him down. So we'll need to also get that skin off him. Doesn't cause him any issue, but it's not something you want to leave on and build up or anything like that. And if nothing else, it's quite unsightly. But it's a good indicator, as I said, that the cage conditions are not quite right, so we'll need to work on that too. And for his troubles, what we'll do is in the next day, it's a Friday here in Melbourne, over the weekend we will, it was close, over the weekend we will we'll give him a feed, and as I said, he eats fairly good sized rats. So he's due for a feed, and the weather is starting to warm up, even though their conditions are relatively simulated. Still keep them a bit cooler this time of year, because we are in Melbourne, and even though they come from a completely different environment, it nevertheless still gets a little bit cooler where they are. And also, being a forest animal, they don't live in the baking heat necessarily. They certainly live in a far warmer place than Melbourne, but they don't necessarily love it hot all the time, because they live in rainforests and other forested areas. As I mentioned, they like it. They probably like the conditions cooler than most people would think. And thankfully right now, as I say, I haven't actually managed to wear a bite yet, which is good. If I keep my hand busy, he'll focus on my hand, not so much my face, because he's only small, and he has bitten me once. I must admit, he has bitten me once, and I was just not quick enough to get my hand out of the way. So I went nearly 12 months without actually getting bitten, which is pretty good. But look, at some point, I'm definitely probably going to cop a bite or two in the process of trying to get this guy accustomed to being handled. And he did hit me on the hand there, but no damage. But hopefully that'll be minimal, and the damage will be minimal as well. But saying that, as I say, I really, really hope you've enjoyed meeting our scrub python. To this date, we only have the one male, and at some point we will actually get a second, a female, to pair up with this. And the intent is to one day hopefully breed this particular guy in years down the track. You're probably 3 or 4, maybe more years away from breeding, but that's okay. It's more about maintaining them actually in captivity and enjoying them. I'm hoping this guy probably lives well beyond 25, 30 odd years and sees me out into being a pretty old sort of a person, maybe even outlives me, and then actually becomes someone that my kids will even look after one day. But yeah, there you go, the Australian scrub python, or the amethystine python, or simply known, it's simply known by Aussies as the scrubby. We love to call them the scrubby. Beautiful, beautiful snake. The light won't be doing him justice, because it certainly won't be showing up that beautiful rainbow pattern that they're known for if they were out in the sun. But maybe when the weather warms up, as we get further into spring and summer, we might be able to get him out in the sun as he grows. Maybe he's actually going to settle down by then, and he won't be so defensive and wanting to bite my face off as much. But nevertheless, I do love the yet unnamed fellow, and I'm deeply indebted and grateful to my friend Matt in South Australia for breeding him and sending one over last year. And it's actually been a real delight to have this guy. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed. Maybe you've learned something. If you've got any comments or questions, leave them down below in the comments section. I'll get back to you. If you'd like to know anything else about that particular species, same thing. And hopefully in the coming sort of weeks and months, we can put out a few more videos that we introduce you to more animals within our collection, and some that maybe possess a little bit more venom than this particular guy. So we've got a few of those in the collection as well, a few venomous snakes, and we might introduce you to those as well. But for now, we'll just say goodbye, and to say goodbye to Mr. Grumpy Pants. We'll put him away. Even that's going to be pretty interesting watching him go back in his cage, because the moment I go to touch him on the tail, he's going to go off like a firecracker again. But this has gone down pretty well, I think. So hopefully you've had a good look, and enjoy. See you later. Yeah, I know, I touch you on the bum and you go all rah, rah, rah.